Buonasera, sono Leonardo.
Good evening, my name is Leonardo and I'm part of We Science, the group of young people at Bergamo Scienza. Before starting, I ask you the following. I'd like to remind you that connecting to the website bergamoscienza.it and pressing on follow via streaming. You can follow via streaming directly through the Bergamo Scienza YouTube channel or through the YouTube page, the Facebook page. You can send questions to the speakers or invite your friends and followers to follow the conference via streaming. The web questions come to us and we will select them during the Q&A session. The conferences of the 23rd edition of Bergamo Scienza are made accessible to people with motor and sensor disabilities, guaranteeing places without architectural barriers and speech-language translation. Some of the conferences are also sent via streaming. Conferences with foreign guests provide simultaneous translation, and the translations will be published onto our channels at the end of the festival. These services are made available thanks to the Fondazione Comunità Bergamasca e Fondazione Barca di Bergamo that, together with Bergamo Scienza, promote accessibility and inclusion. For simultaneous translation, you can scan the QR code the volunteers can give you and that you see projected here. The QR code will directly take you to the Converso web hub where you can select the interpretation language from the drop-down menu. To listen to the translation, you need headsets. If you have your headsets, you can use yours. Otherwise, if you don't have them with you, you can ask the volunteers to give you a pair of headsets. I'd like to welcome you to this evening's event, Connected Connections That Heal. The speaker will be Julianne Holt-Lunstad. Luigi Ripamonti from Corriere della Sera will moderate this lecture. Please silence your mobile phones and thank you for your attention.
Bene, allora
Great, so we can start. Let's be connected, very connected, because we're talking about connections that heal. And I think
okay. There is a lot of people.
There are a lot of people here. We're all very connected with us. We're not isolated.
Solitude. Okay, allora ringrazio.
Okay, I'd like to really thank Bergamo Scienza for having called me this year too. It's always wonderful. The atmosphere is great. Lots and lots of people. I talked about connections because this is what we're going to talk about with Professor Julianne Holt-Lunstad. And this is a fundamental and almost paradoxical topic, allow me to say. We're ever more connected through social media, etc., and still we feel more isolated and lonely. So there is another paradox, because isolation, as Professor will tell us, is something real, objective, whilst the loneliness that derives from it is something subjective. And although being subjective, it's really making lots of people fall ill. So let's be aware of this and stay connected to a professor who will explain more about this. To you.
Good afternoon. I'm really grateful to be here. As was described, I am really excited to be talking to you about connections, particularly in a place where I always feel quite connected to here in Italy. Just by way of introduction, some of the research that I am most well known for is some of my findings that have demonstrated that lacking social connection carries a risk similar to smoking up to 15 cigarettes per day. Now, when some people hear this statistic, perhaps it's a bit surprising. And so I'm going to go into a lot more detail about the research that went into this and, of course, the larger body of evidence that shows just how critically important this is for our health. You may have also been seeing attention nationally or internationally from government and other organizations that are taking on what is being referred to as a loneliness epidemic. Now, keep in mind, we've started to see some of this reference well before the pandemic, as can be depicted in some of these images. But we have governments such as the UK and Japan that have appointed ministers for loneliness. The US has come up with a national strategy. Recently, the World Health Organization issued a commission report on social connection. And interestingly, South Korea took the tangible steps of offering a monthly stipend to young adults who were isolated to simply pay them to go engage in society. So we see growing attention around this issue, but what do we know about it? What is the evidence? So today I want to talk about what is social connection and why is our social life so important? Why should we care? And this is relevant because our social lives are changing quite a bit. And how this actually is a matter of life and death and can impact nearly every aspect of life. But ultimately, we also need to make sure we create a life worth living. So when we think of our social life, we might think of getting together with friends, family, enjoying our time together. But it's really more than just this quality time. And I share this quote by C.S. Lewis that says, "Friendship is unnecessary. Like philosophy, like art, it has no survival value. Rather, it is one of those things which give value to survival." Now, I share this quote because it represents common belief, and that is that our social relationships are what bring meaning and value to our lives. But I will actually show evidence that it indeed does impact survival. And so I want to dispel this myth that that perhaps our social life is not necessary, and indeed it truly is. Now, this is part of a larger body of evidence that has asked, and survey after survey, when they ask people, what is the key to happiness? Time and time again, what we see is that it's not success, it's not wealth, it's our close relationships. It's our relationships with friends, family, and others. And so it's interesting that one of the truisms in life is that we often don't appreciate what matters most until it's taken away. And while there's been decades of evidence on the importance of social connection, it took a global pandemic for us to more broadly start to really appreciate just how important our social connections are. But it's also important to recognize that our social lives are changing. And so what was often, more often, a way of getting together with others, we are now often socializing in very distant and remote ways. And interestingly, we are isolated together. So I'll just go back for a second to really first acknowledge that just because something is changing doesn't necessarily mean it's bad, but when we look at various trends, we can kind of see and get a picture of how this is actually impacting people. How are people faring? And so when we look at the data from one of the largest surveys around the globe, it included data from 142 countries. What we see is that nearly a quarter of the global population reports that they are very or fairly lonely. And this is particularly true and highest among our younger populations. Now, what we see is that across countries, people aren't equally lonely. And so, interestingly, when we look at the countries where more than a third of the country reports loneliness, 22 of the 29 countries were in Africa. So what this suggests is that this is not just a wealthy nation. It's not just a U.S. or a Europe kind of phenomenon, but rather what we can see is that this is a global phenomenon. And in fact, we see it nearly in every country that we look. And we know that loneliness is important, but we also know that it isn't the entire picture. Now, I want to share some data with you, and this comes from the American Time Use Survey. This is a survey that looks at how people are using the minutes of their day and what they're using it for. And if you look in the top left corner, what we see is that over the past 2 decades, this starts in 2003 and ends in 2020. So over the past 2 decades, what we see is time spent in isolation has significantly increased. Time spent with household family and non-household family has decreased. Time spent with friends significantly decreased. Time spent with others decreased, and time spent in companionship also decreased. We can see that these have decreased across this, and this is just part of a larger body of evidence that shows that across a number of indicators, from living alone to the household size, we see globally some of these indicators showing more and more disconnection. And if we look at more informal kinds of data, this is data from Google searches globally. And interestingly, the Google search for where to meet people, how to make friends, this is at an historic all-time high. So what this suggests is that not only are we disconnected from others, but that there is this desire to be more connected, and that people don't know how to do it if they have to Google it. So we are disconnected in a variety of ways, and yet we tend to focus primarily on the feeling of loneliness, which may just be the symptom. And this is part of a larger body of evidence that suggests that social connection is a fundamental human need. So if we look across species, what we see is that being part of a group is critical to survival. So whether it is efficiency of effort, direction to safety, evading predators, warmth, protection from the elements, pooling of resources, obtaining food, all of these are incredibly important functions for survival. And interestingly, we see that this is also important for humans as well. And in fact, humans are one of the most vulnerable species at birth. If a human were left alone, it would literally die. We need others. And because of this, neuroscientists have argued that our brains have adapted to expect social proximity. And that when we are alone and we are not part of a group, that our brains have to work harder, both to be vigilant to threats in our environment, but also to manage the everyday demands of life. And so because of this, what is suggested is that when our brains have to be more active, that this can create dysregulation in multiple systems of the body, and that our bodies function most optimally when we are social, and that this dysregulation when we are not over time can put us at increased risk for a variety of illnesses. So what's interesting is that neuroscientists have argued that loneliness is similar to hunger or thirst. It is a biological drive that motivates us. It's uncomfortable, but it motivates us to meet a biological need. And so just like hunger motivates us to seek out food, that loneliness motivates us to reconnect socially. And so if we use this same analogy, then isolation, which is more objective, would be the equivalent of, objectively lacking social connection, or in the analogy, it would be akin to objectively lacking food. Now, if we take this analogy a step farther, we know that quality is important too. So just like food and water are critical for survival, food can spoil, water can be unclean, and those can make us sick. And similarly, we need social connection, but quality matters. And when that quality is poor, that can actually put us at risk. Now, when we look across multiple scientific disciplines, the way in which we engage socially with others has been measured in a variety of ways. And this has led to a lot of confusion. And so we really need an organizing framework for this. And so my colleagues and I have organized this in terms of using the term social connection as an umbrella term that encompasses all of the ways in which this has been studied. And these fall under three broad categories, which I refer to as the pillars of social connection. And these include the structure, function, and quality. So the structure really refers to more of the objective aspects of our connections and include things like marital status and just having people and the size of our social networks and how frequently we engage with others. So this is the extent to which we have others in our life. But we know that we need to go beyond just having people in our life, and that it's also important to recognize that we need to be able to rely on these people. And so this has to do with the function, so the extent to which we can rely on others for support. And then finally is this quality element, recognizing that not all connections are equally positive, and that although our relationships can be sources of joy, they can also be sources of frustration and conflict. And so we need to take that into account. And so what our evidence suggests is that when social connection is high, risk is low. And when social connection is low, risk is high. So this is part of a body of research that is now really looking at how social connection is so critical to our health and well-being. And I want to remind you that this is the definition, what I have on the screen here is the definition from the World Health Organization. This has actually been in their constitution since the 1940s. And it says, health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And unfortunately, this element of social well-being has been ignored for far too long. And it's time that we start to really give it the attention that it deserves. So let's go into a little bit more about what we know about this. And some of the strongest evidence that we have is around mortality. And what it suggests is that our social life is actually really is a matter of life and death. So and this is also part of some of the evidence that shows that social connection is important to not only individual health and well-being, but community safety, resilience, and prosperity. So let's get back to the data around mortality. So my colleagues and I, we wanted to understand the overall effect that this has on mortality. And so we did a meta-analysis of studies that had looked at the extent to which people lacked social connection and whether it predicted earlier death. And we had data from over 3.4 million people globally. And what we found was that loneliness was associated with a 26% increased risk for earlier death, social isolation, 29%, and living alone by 32%. And of course, this was independent of age, initial health status, and other factors that would otherwise predict earlier death. And then in an earlier meta-analysis with a similar methodology, we looked at the flip side of this. How protective is being socially connected? And what we found was that that was associated with a 50% increased odds of survival. So that was the protective effects was significantly bigger than the risks associated with those deficits. But despite this, we were worried that people may not recognize just how important this is. And so my colleagues and I, we wanted to really identify, like, what is the magnitude of this? Because we hear all the time a variety of factors that are important for our health, but how do we weigh which ones we should be taking most seriously? And so what we did is we looked at the data that we had on a variety of indicators of social connection. And these are in the yellow bars. But we also looked at what is the data that we have on a variety of other factors that predict earlier death. And those are depicted in the blue bars and include things like smoking, alcohol consumption, flu vaccine, physical inactivity, obesity, and air pollution. And what we see is that the effect sizes here are on par with these other factors that we take quite seriously for our health. And what this data suggests is that we should be taking our social connections just as seriously. Now, this is also part of research that shows that this goes beyond just mortality, but also looks at health. And I'll note that the mortality data was death from all causes, and the majority of them were disease-related. And indeed, we see evidence of the impact on heart disease, stroke, dementia, type 2 diabetes, depression, anxiety, as well as premature death. And so when we talk about loneliness and we think about how distressing that is just the tip of the iceberg. And we see the consequences are far bigger. Now, when we think about our social life, we also need to recognize that it has a ripple effect across nearly every aspect of life. Now, I want to remind you, it was not that long ago that during the pandemic, we had to socially distance. We had to reduce our social contact. And in doing so, it impacted literally every sector of society. It impacted education. It impacted the workplace, the health sector, travel, leisure, you name it, it affected it. And what that suggests is that there is social relevance to literally every sector of society and every aspect of life. And so we need to think about what kinds of ripple effects our social life has. And what we are starting to recognize is that social disconnection may be related and at the root of not only health concerns, but the health of our communities, the health of our institutions, and the health of society. We can see it at the root of political polarization, suicide, national security, you name it. So we need to start thinking about how this is contributing to these other issues. I'm just going to highlight a few. So we're starting to gain information around how isolation may be related to other kinds of factors. So we know that when people are isolated, they need to be more vigilant to threats in their environment. And this can lead to distrust. And what we're seeing is high rates of distrust in society, distrust in others, and distrust in institutions. And when we can't trust the institutions that enforce fairness in society, we often distrust others. And so we're seeing this more and more in political polarization as well, and the tendency to also have this us versus them kind of mentality. And this is a very self-protective, defensive kind of approach that we see. We also see that even in animals, that when they are isolated, that it leads to a lot of hostility and aggression. We also are seeing this related to radicalization and extremism. And if we think about how fundamental the need to belong, the need for human connection is, that oftentimes those who are isolated may be more prone to this because they may seek out connection in more unhealthy ways, to feel a part of a group, a part of a cause. And so this has become an increasing concern for a variety of governments. We also see the importance of social connection when it comes to resilience. And so whether our connections can help us from our own personal crises, we also see larger community and societal crises. And when it comes to crises such as fires, floods, hurricanes, wars, and so on, what we see is that when people are more socially connected, they are more resilient. And in fact, in the case of a natural disaster or natural hazard, such as a fire or flood, we see that communities where people know each other can be literally a matter of life and death. In communities in which individuals know each other are better prepared for these crises. They're more likely to recover from these crises and are more resilient overall. So we see that not only is social connection critical to our personal health and our personal well-being, but it's also been linked to population health, including things like spread of illness. We even see data when it comes to violence and safety. For example, there was one study that showed that communities that were more socially connected had a 21% reduction in murders, a 20% reduction in car thefts, and are more resilient to a variety of safety threats. We also are seeing more and more data suggesting that social connection is important for businesses and economic prosperity. And this can benefit both employers and employees alike. So for instance, when the workplace is more socially connected, this is associated with increased job performance. It's associated with reduced turnover. And it's associated with reduced sick days. So this helps both the employer and the employee. So together, what this data suggests is that social connection not only can be the key to understanding and addressing our personal health, but also pressing social issues and Importantly, also the key to thriving. Now, interestingly, when I talk about social isolation, people have the mental picture in their mind, like the most extreme cases. Now, this is an example of, a Hollywood depiction of isolation, but they picture this extreme isolation, or something similar to this idea that people are just all alone in a dark home. But in reality, in our modern world, this is what isolation looks like. We have created a society in which it is incredibly comfortable and convenient to never leave our home. It is now often preferred to work remotely, to get our food delivered, to get our entertainment streaming into the home. And even if we do go out, oftentimes more and more businesses are using automated kinds of features that limit the kind of interaction that people have. And sadly, when I talk about this issue, people also want to know, well, what can we do about it? And thankfully, we have a huge amount of effort that is ongoing trying to find solutions. However, unfortunately, the majority of these fail. So the majority of approaches, unfortunately, are common sense approaches that may not necessarily have much basis in evidence. And even when various data has been collected on any kind of treatment, not just for isolation, is that, again, 95% of them fail, and oftentimes it takes a really long time to develop effective treatments. Now, we have no shortage of those that claim to have a cure for loneliness. Unfortunately, the majority of those often have a greater motivation in the economic benefits of those, or they are perhaps short-sighted and are only treating the symptom and not looking at the root cause of what is leading to that in the first place. And so we really need to make sure that we aren't just putting Band-Aid types of approaches into place and instead getting to the root cause of the issue. So how do we do that? I want to also note that what we see is that most solutions are focused on those on the extreme end. So imagine this figure I have. Imagine that this is the distribution of the population. And what our evidence suggests is that social connection is on a continuum. And every single one of us is somewhere on that continuum. But the majority of our solutions are focused on the extreme end of this continuum. And so we're only looking at those that are most severely affected. Now, of course, those most severely affected do need help and support and solutions. But unfortunately, even if those solutions work, we are ignoring a vast majority of the population. And so instead, what I argue is that we need to start looking at societal approaches. And by looking at this through a preventative kind of lens or a societal level approach, instead of affecting a small group, we can potentially shift the entire risk trajectory. So in order to do this, we need a whole of society approach. Now, when I was working closely with the Office of the Surgeon General in the US, we devised a national strategy for this. Now, I recognize that Italy may be doing much better than the US, but we did draw upon global data and and global recommendations when devising these recommendations. So there's much to be learned, and in fact, there's much in common with the World Health Organization's recommendations as well. And in fact, this included 6 key pillars that we can think of and look to as we guide our efforts. And the first is that we need to strengthen the social infrastructure of our local communities. And that is ensuring that we have places and spaces for people to gather, to socialize. And these are often becoming less and less. The second is that we need to enact pro-connection public policies. Now, in some ways, people are a little bit surprised by that and wonder what kind of policies might have an effect. But we can also think about the kinds of policies that can become barriers. And so just like whether it's government policies or workplace policies, that just as we might do evaluations of the environmental or economic impact of a particular policy, we need to evaluate what are the social implications of any and all policies, and to create a social in all policy kind of approach. The third is that we need to mobilize the health sector. We have good evidence this relates to our physical health, and yet far too often the medical community is unaware of this, and there needs to be more education and awareness, both in terms of healthcare providers, but how that is passed on to patients, and expand the health services around this. The fourth is reforming digital environments. And we know that technology can be both a tool for good as well as for harm. And so we need to really harness the strengths and put some guardrails around some of the potential harms. The fifth is that we need to deepen our knowledge. And we already have a robust set of evidence, but there are still gaps in what we know, and we need to be able to increase this. We also need to increase public awareness. And so, for instance, I recently did a survey where we asked people what factors influence their health. And overwhelmingly, what we found was that people saw social connection as relevant to their emotional well-being and mental health, but not for their physical health. And so we need to start raising awareness. And then the final pillar of this is to build a culture of connection. So even if we build parks and spaces for people to connect, even if we implement various policies, if all of these do not reflect the community's values, all of these things will fall flat. They will not be effective. And so what we need to do is we need to cultivate norms of connection, including norms of kindness and respect and service and commitment to each other. And this needs to be modeled by the leaders in our communities and the leaders in our organizations. And so we need to not only address the problems of social disconnection, including isolation and loneliness, but we really need to create an environment in which people can truly thrive and harness the benefits of connection. So I want to close by drawing an analogy. Now, I want you to just indulge me for a moment, and I want you to imagine that there was a new drug that was introduced on the market. And this drug could increase your survival by as much as 50%. It could reduce your risk for cardiovascular disease by 29%. Reduce your risk of stroke by 32%. Reduce your risk for depression, both developing new depression and the severity of that depression. It would also reduce your risk for developing dementia. and can increase your immune response so that you're less susceptible to cold and flu viruses. And all of that, and it has few, if any, side effects and actually can increase your well-being. Now, of course, I'm not talking about a new drug. I'm talking about social connection. But if I were talking about a new drug, everyone would want to go out and ask their doctor for this. In fact, they might want to try and invest in it. And what I would like to argue is that we need to have just as much enthusiasm to invest in our social connections. So thank you.
I want this drug and I want it right now. Bene, allora, grazie.
Right. Thank you, Professor Holt-Lunstad. Fantastic. Now, I think we can open the Q&A session. So the floor goes to you. We see if there's anybody who has questions. We already have Gianvito Martino, Professor Martino. Please. I'll speak Italian. Recently, well, first of all, thank you for your lecture. It was wonderful. Recently, we saw a very important piece of work, I guess you know, on a prestigious magazine like Nature that demonstrates not just what you said today, but also that there is a biological change in patients who are lonely because inflammation increases, inflammatory proteins increase considerably. So there is also a physical consequence when being lonely, which obviously also suggests a certain type of behavior also from the therapeutic viewpoint. Do you believe in this data? I mean, do you believe this data is real and has been collected correctly? Thank you.
Yes, in fact, I debated whether to include, there's a large body of evidence looking at the biological mechanisms by which our social connections can impact health. And I think inflammation is a really promising one because, first off, we have a variety of studies that have shown that the pathways by which loneliness could influence inflammation. And so also we know that when it impacts this chronic inflammation, that inflammation has been implicated in cardiovascular disease, it's in dementia, in depression, all of these kinds of outcomes that we see. And so what I think is quite telling about that particular pathway is that it helps us organize what might be viewed as a variety of kinds of outcomes that might have a single common pathway. But we also have evidence that it's not just the immune pathway. We have evidence around cardiovascular effects. In fact, I've done a series of studies looking at cardiovascular functioning. We have evidence on neuroendocrine functioning, immune functioning. There's a small but growing body of evidence also on gut microbiome. And so we're seeing that through multiple pathways, the biological plausibility on how these things are connected to disease risk and ultimately earlier death.
Altre domande? Ce n'è una là in fondo, vedo.
Any other question? Yes, there's one at the back of the room, it seems.
La mia domanda è:
My question is,
impattano sull'isolamento sociale dei giovani
How much
le difficoltà o addirittura l'impossibilità di raggiungere pietre miliari della vita.
does the difficulty of reaching important milestones in one's life on the feeling of loneliness and social disconnect of young people, the fact of not being able to buy a house, of making a family, of having a proper job, etc.?
Yeah, so we know that any kind of major life transition can be potentially a trigger point for isolation and loneliness. And we see this across the life course. At earlier stages in life, in fact, we see some evidence suggesting that isolation and loneliness may peak at age 19, which interestingly is often the time when young adults leave their family of origin and either live apart from them, go to university, do something away. We also see it among new parents when people have changes in jobs, migration, retirement, widowhood. Anytime there is a life transition, this can disrupt your social network and can put someone at increased risk. Now, of course, it isn't 100%, and many people remain resilient during these times. But we need to pay careful attention because these are important trigger points. And so for young people, we are seeing this data consistently across the globe, that young people are at the highest rates of loneliness. And in fact, when I first started studying this topic, while my work always looked across the life course, when the public and organizations started paying attention, it was focused almost entirely on older adults. But we are seeing that young people seem to be struggling the most. And so there may be many factors that are playing a role. So other factors might include things like use of technology and social media, and now we're seeing the rise in AI companions. So there's the tech side of it. There's also this, as you mentioned, economic pressures. And we see consistent data that those who are struggling economically are also at increased risk for isolation and loneliness. And so when you have this accumulation of risk factors, that may be accounting for this group having the highest prevalence rates.
Ben due domande.
There are two questions down there.
Sì, grazie.
Thank you.
Sì, no, mi chiedevo questo. Indubbiamente
That's my question.
il
There is no doubt that social disconnection is typical for advanced society. If you think of the post-war society, a poor society where there were primary needs, and then there was also human solidarity. It was easier to create a community rather than today. What is a source of concern is the culture of connection. Indeed, we developed these cultures because there are
mettere in atto qualche soluzione a questi problemi.
Or better, are there projects to try and find a solution to this problem of social isolation, social disconnection?
Thank you, and apologies for the delay. I'm waiting for the translation. So I appreciate the question because there is considerable work looking at the kinds of solutions that are needed and the extent to which they are effective. I will point to a couple of, there are not only some meta-analyses of this, and I'll share one that I did. So for example, I did a meta-analysis of 106 randomized controlled trials of interventions that were implemented in clinical settings, most often hospital settings. And what was found was that when some kind of psychosocial intervention was provided to patients, in addition to standard medical treatment, that this was associated with a 20% increase odds of survival relative to just standard medical treatment alone. And so we have evidence of the importance of this in the medical setting. But we also have I was involved with a evidence and gap map that the World Health Organization published. There's actually two, one focused on tech-based solutions and the other is on in-person solutions. Now, what that found was that while there are effective solutions, that unfortunately in many cases the methodology was not very strong, and so we do need stronger kinds of evidence for many of the solutions that are out there. I have now been appointed to part of the I'm on the guidelines committee for the World Health Organization, and that committee is tasked with identifying the evidence around solutions and establishing guidelines for those who are doing solutions to try to ensure that the efforts that are happening globally are evidence-based so that we can put our time and resources into the kinds of solutions that are going to be most effective.
One question over there. Please, there. Actually, there are two questions. The lady has been raising her hand for some time now, so please bring the microphone to her. Thank you very much. Your lecture was extremely interesting. While listening to you, I thought of something that was said by Professor Martino yesterday evening concerning the prohibition, or better, his conviction that we should be prohibiting people who are less than 16 to use, if I understood well, Professor Martino, please correct me if I'm wrong, to use smartphones so prohibition to use smartphones if you are below the age of 16. What do you think about this? Given the topic you dealt with, because in my opinion, I believe that the proposals you made is also to conceive the public space, the urban space in a special manner, as you said, and also personally convinced that unless people wish to be with the other, there is no change possible. So you must desire to be with the other. And so I thought of what Professor Martino said, to prohibit the use of cellular phones. So we should be educating young people to desire to be with other children. And to do so, we should be prohibiting them to use cellular phones.
Yeah, so the question whether to prohibit the use of cellular phones for those under 16, I actually served on National Academies of Science Consensus Committee on the health effects of social media social media and adolescent health. And interestingly, what we found was that there is a very, very complex evidence base and debate even among scientists on some of these issues. And so it was a very challenging task. But what I think is interesting is that while we did find evidence of both benefits and harms to youth in terms of the use of social media, that included both elements even within individual. And so even the groups that were most likely to benefit also were most likely to be harmed as well. And so while there's still a lot of debate, only because, I shouldn't say only, but some of this debate becomes raised because a lot of the evidence is correlational. However, we have very robust evidence on the benefits of in-person connection, and enough evidence of potential harms to make us quite concerned. And so, from that standpoint, certainly the kinds of efforts that can help youth socialize more in person rather than on their smartphones are going to be, based on all the evidence that we have, should have a net positive there. And the hard part is that many argue that the particular groups, so for example, youth that are marginalized that may not have support in their local community often look to social media as a lifeline. So there is the concern that if that goes away, that could potentially harm that group. But ultimately, why they're turning to that is because they don't have the support in their local communities. And so if we can really support our youth in person, that would have a far bigger effect and benefit.
C'era una domanda là in fondo, non so se c'è ancora.
Salve.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the lecture, which was very interesting. I wanted to go back to what happened with COVID. The fact that we all learned to be isolated. We've learned a lot about isolation. I was wondering if you can learn about isolation, you can also forget about isolation. So I was wondering, are there any social studies about how long it takes to change a habit of this kind and move from isolation to social connection? Thank you.
You raised two really important points that I want to touch on, and that is the timing, and then also how quickly can we shift. And so when it comes to the timing, we have very good evidence that the more persistent isolation and loneliness is over time, the more detrimental it is. And so if we can turn that around, it can the risk can be reduced. So for example, studies that follow people over time, those that report isolation and loneliness at multiple time points show much stronger health risks compared to those that may have only reported it at one point, but then not at other time points. And so I think it's critically important that we recognize that this can be reversed. Unfortunately, what we don't have is the precise timing, because each study times those follow-ups differently. So in some studies, it might be monthly, it might be at time 1 is and time 2 are a year apart, et cetera. And so certainly during the pandemic, lots of people asked me, including reporters, like, at what point in time are we all going to start experiencing these health risks? And while we can't pinpoint the exact time, we do know that persistent and consistent over time is associated with greater risk. But I think the second point that you made was that we were able to quickly shift. And in fact, I had the privilege of, right before the outgoing administration in the US, I was able to meet with 35 government agencies to share some of my findings with them and help them recognize how it related to their own work. And I challenged them at the end, and I would challenge all of you, whether in your role as a citizen, as a parent, as a leader in your community, whatever role that you play, I challenge them to think about how quickly literally every aspect of society was able to mobilize. And businesses changed, education changed. We were able to do that swiftly and very quickly to socially distance. Now, my challenge is, can we do that in the opposite direction, to connect? And I would challenge all of you to think about how you could do that, because it's really what we need. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is that there are lingering effects of the pandemic. And while in many ways, many people have gone back to normal, and it feels like that is something in our long distant past, we still see remnants of it as many still prefer to use or to remote work compared to going into the office. Many people prefer to get their entertainment streaming at home. Many people prefer the use of a lot of these tools that, in essence, are quite convenient, but nonetheless separate us from our community. And so there is reason to believe that the effects could continue if we don't change our habits.
C'è una domanda qui.
There's a question here.
Sì, questo signore.
Yes, this gentleman here.
Vado.
Shall I? I wanted to know what you think about another solution. There are people who love being on their own because they are their own leaders, but then also by being on their own, they can develop their own knowledge or philosophical insight. You can satisfy your artistic trends. And there is also a proverb that says it's better to be on your own rather than be accompanied by bad people. So what do you think about this?
Again, a great question. There are two parts to it I want to address. The first is the potential benefits of solitude and being alone, and then the second is it better to be alone or versus having negative kinds of relationships? And certainly there are some benefits to alone time, as long as it doesn't become this consistent and persistent over isolation over time. And interestingly, we have quite strong evidence. In fact, there was another recent meta-analysis of social isolation on mortality and found that it was significantly higher than the effects of loneliness. And so, and this is for mortality. And this effect of isolation was independent of whether someone actually felt lonely. Because of course you can be isolated, you want to be alone, you take great pleasure in that isolation. and may not feel lonely at all. And this showed that isolation, even if you didn't feel lonely, was associated with increased risk for earlier death. And so while this may be useful from time to time, if it becomes consistent and chronic is when it tends to have poorer kinds of outcomes. And so the emotional pathway is just one pathway that links to these biological pathways that we recently talked about, so that sense of threat that can trigger all sorts of biological pathways. But we also have evidence that individuals who may be living alone, that particularly in later in life, this can, if there was a fall or a acute kind of health issue, if no one's around, that can often be a matter of life and death. And so we still need people in our lives, even if we do enjoy our alone time. And so it's more about the balance of that rather than saying you can never be alone, because of course that's okay. And that's also true, interestingly enough, for loneliness. Like, we don't want to get rid of it entirely, because that is the adaptive signal that helps us reconnect. And again, it's only when loneliness is consistent and persistent that it becomes a problem. The second part of that question was about whether we're better off alone or with bad relationships. And hopefully you have enough people in your social network that it isn't a matter of choice. So that if you were to leave a bad relationship or distance yourself from a bad relationship, that there would be other good relationships in your life, so that it wouldn't have to be being entirely alone. And so, unfortunately, we see risk associated both with bad relationships and with chronic isolation and loneliness. And so, I would encourage people to really try to nurture and strengthen relationships in your life. And I'll add one thing that I know wasn't part of your question. But we also, when we think about social connection, we often think of just our closest relationships, but we do have evidence that we need a variety of types of people in our lives. Not just our friends and family, but our coworkers, our neighbors, people in our community, even strangers. There's evidence of the benefits of even, saying hello to people on public transport. So we want to make sure that we have a variety of people in our lives to fulfill the variety of kinds of needs and desires and goals that we may have, and that this can help build resilience for a variety of aspects of life.
Are there further questions? One there.
Sì, parlo italiano, ma in piedi no, posso stare seduta. Senta, la ringrazio tantissimo.
Thank you so much for your lecture.
Ho colto particolarmente un'espressione sua che
I
risponde a
focused
quello
on
che
what you
sento.
said, and this matches very well what I feel. You said that in order to defeat isolation, if I understood well, so if to defeat isolation, sick, loneliness, you need to open up. You need to be willing to cater for your community, for the people you know. So my question is, Can your analysis and research help solve this problem? Because this is a world problem. It keeps growing because we live in isolation. We believe that we are alone. We have no solutions, and the very few solutions you are suggesting, stronger communities, etc. So these are very few happy people that have these strong communities, because there are ways to marginalize people. So I'm asking whether the finding of your research shouldn't be shared with those who take decisions important for our life. Because common good, community service, we were all born to live together, to support each other, to be happy together. On the other side, we have the monster destroying us, power, profit. My piece of advice, but please, this is an invitation, because I see how you speak, the way you speak good, and this is very good. I mean, this gives meaning to what you said, the way you said it. But wouldn't it be the case to take into consideration the possibility to stop these monsters, these destructive monsters who are thinking of their power and their profit? They are self-referential. And you might well understand what I'm referring to: market laws, finance. They want to keep us isolated. They want us dead so that they can take and steal energy to increase their profits. Anyway, thank you very much for what you said and how you said it.
Thank you so much for that comment and question. I think many of us in the room recognize that there are powers out there that are profiting from our loneliness, are profiting from our isolation, and that there are incentives to keep people isolated. And whether this be for economic gain, political gain, or other kinds of gains. And so, of course, part of that is recognizing each one of us as maybe we are personally struggling, that it's easy to perhaps fall into the trap of thinking it's your own personal failure, and perhaps not recognizing the larger powers at play that are reinforcing this in our communities and in our society. And so we do need systemic change in order to have some of the larger kinds of changes. But I don't want that to leave anyone feeling powerless, because we've seen example after example where a single individual has done things in their own communities that have had a ripple effect, from starting a community garden that has gathered people together to all sorts of ideas where it helps communities come together, and that it can change the norms. It can change how people trust one another and how they can work together towards a common cause. And so don't underestimate your power as an individual, because together we can make the change that we all desperately need and want.
Non vedo altre mani alzate.
I don't see any other hand raised, so allow me to ask a question out of curiosity. We discussed the physical repercussions of loneliness. We mentioned inflammation, for instance, and I'm thinking of pain or suffering, physical pain, which is connected to our evolution, because if I feel pain when I touch fire, I will take my hand away, so I'll be safe from getting burned. At the same time, we saw how isolation is something harming us, so to remediate it is something that allows us to evolve. So I'm asking if there are neurobiological correlates for loneliness, like we have it for pain, for suffering. For instance, is there a prefrontal cortex or amygdala that is connected to loneliness and that, if treated, could save us?
So interestingly, there was a really interesting set of studies done by Naomi Eisenberg at UCLA, where she was able to look at various areas of the brain related to pain. And what she found was that in particular, rejection was associated with similar pathways so this kind of social pain was associated with similar pathways as physical pain. Now, keep in mind, of course, with these kinds of studies, they're necessarily relatively small sample sizes because they're quite expensive to do. But nonetheless, this is really kind of promising and interesting results. There was also another study done at MIT that was really interesting that looked at this same kind of idea that as we talk about how this hurts, that how it might be related to other kinds of physical sensations like physical pain. And another study looked at how it relates to this idea of hunger. And what they found was that they actually had some participants who went without food for 10 hours and some participants that went without socializing for 10 hours. And they showed similar neural pathways for both of those. And so we're starting to get some of these hints of how these things may be more than just analogies, but may carry similar biological pathways. And so as we are getting a bit more sophisticated, we're also starting to try to get at some of the kind of causal mechanisms of how it is that isolation or loneliness, or conversely being socially connected, ultimately influences these health outcomes. And there's some also really interesting work where they did find through, and this is not my own work, so but want to highlight some of this work, is that there was, they looked at the genetic Mendelian randomization and found that there was a causal link between loneliness and depression, and it was bidirectional. So both, and this is consistent with a host of other kinds of research that shows these bidirections and it finds that not only does loneliness increase risk for depression, but depression increases risk for loneliness. And the implications for this, the causal pathway, is that but potentially by treating the loneliness, we can prevent the development of depression. And so that was the conclusion of the authors, and so we're really, I think, on the cusp of finding ways that this can have some really important clinical kinds of implications.
Molte grazie.
Thank you very much.
Ecco, c'è una domanda.
There is one more question. This is the last one.
Buonasera.
Good evening. I'd like to ask you whether volunteering, voluntary activities, could play an important role to avoid loneliness, could become a drug. The one you illustrated, you showed us these pink pills that you showed in your slides. So I'm asking whether volunteering could become an integral part of this drug that we should all take against loneliness.
Yes, in fact, we have large population studies that show that volunteering is protective, and interestingly, we see similar kinds of effects both for formal volunteering, where you volunteer for a formal organization, as well as more informal kinds of service and helping within your local community, and on service within interpersonal, so supporting and helping others on an individual basis. And so this has tremendous potential because, let me share an example of one of the studies that I did. It was a randomized controlled trial of 3 different countries, so the US, UK, and Australia. And we randomly assigned people to do small acts of service for someone in their neighborhood over the course of 4 weeks. And what we found was that doing these small acts of service, that they reported less loneliness. They were more likely to report knowing more of their neighbors, less conflict in their neighborhood, less stress, and less depression. There was some country variation in some of those, but what I found to be quite remarkable about this is that we only measured the people doing the acts of service, not the people who are on the receiving end, and presumably the people on the receiving end also benefited. But I think what's so powerful about this is that sometimes when people feel lonely, they often turn inward and wait for others to reach out to them. But what this demonstrates is that one of the best ways you can help yourself is to help others.
Bene. Allora, per chiudere,
To close,
la domanda che ha fatto la signora prima.
I'm referring to the question that was mentioned before about these monsters and economic monsters. It made me think of the Apocalypse, the last book of the Bible. And to close, I would mention Genesis, the first book of the Bible. I recently read that when the Creator decides that it is not good for men to be alone, he created the woman, and the translation is for this woman to stand in front of him, so the one to relate with. If it was written thousands of years ago, we can say that this is a primary need we all share. Thank you very much.